Well, time for another dashing game, sporting adventures for our new sponsor, Brenny Brothers Brewery, www.brennybros.com, pioneers of the Australian brewing industry, having first started brewing beer in Williamstown in 1864. They produce a range of easy drinking mainstream beers that are based on a family recipe from over 100 years ago. I know my next guest has never drunk in his life, so he won't be drinking it, but he's one of the greats. I speak to him regularly about sport. He's now retired and enjoying retirement, but keeping a close eye on sport. And I also thought I'd get him on because we had the great Corbin Middlemass on, and that's up on our Spotify channels at the moment and other various social media platforms too, on the day that the great Dennis Cometti died last week. And I thought I'd get Glenn Mitchell on, who knew Dennis as well as anyone, worked with him as well. Glenn, welcome to the program. Good to have you with us.
G'day, Daniel. How much of the sponsors' product have you been imbibing in recent times?
I've had quite a bit of it. It's an outstanding job. I didn't know much about them. They're involved in the local cricket clubs in the Mornington Peninsula, where in the past I've been broadcasting matches. I've now gone away from that particular company that I was working for there, but I have got to know them, and it's a magnificent drop. I know you don't drink, but yeah, they are magnificent beers, and they're also available at many independent liquor stores and on tap at some great pubs and clubs, and it's Australian-owned family business. But in regard to Dennis, he was one of the greats. He's almost incomparable, Glenn, isn't he?
He is. I mean, the industry that you and I have worked in, Dan, I don't know anyone that has been so universally loved as Dennis, perhaps more so in the Southern and AFL states, but a lot of people would be familiar with him north of the Murray with all the work that he did at Olympic Games, and with the ABC, he did NBL basketball, which he continued with the Seven Network. But yeah, he was an incredible person. And that great combination where he was allied with Bruce McAvaney for 10 years on Friday Night Footy on Channel 7. And whilst we think of Dennis primarily of Channel 7, it was actually Channel 9 that really launched him onto the national stage, if you like, because up until 2001, he was commentating for the 7 Network, and he was primarily, I guess fair to say, to use a term, off-Broadway back then. In 2001, he didn't actually commentate any of Seven's final series, and predominantly just did games in Western Australia. But then it was highly publicised when Nine got the rights for that 5-year period from 2002 onwards that Tim Lane was initially signed by Nine to do Friday nights with Eddie, and then Tim stood by his own principles and decided that when Eddie was going to call Friday night Collingwood games, that Tim stood aside. And Nine had already signed Dennis, but primarily for lesser games on weekends. So when the vacancy came up, they moved Dennis alongside Eddie, and then he stayed 5 years doing that. And then when Seven got the rights again, he spent another 10 years with Bruce. So 15 years in the most prime time for AFL football on a Friday night. And that really gave him the true national exposure and recognition, which was played out when he passed.
Yeah, it was a sad time when it happened, but it was also a great example of celebrating a life of someone like Dennis Cometti, who not only all of us who worked with him, Glenn, there were so many people that got the opportunity to watch and listen to him throughout his magnificent football commentary career, and they could relate to him as well, which isn't an easy thing to do, is it?
It's not. I mean, it will be interesting, and hopefully it's a long, long way down the track, but Bruce McAvaney perhaps would be the next person that would garner that sort of response. Maybe someone like a Ray Warren as well when it comes to rugby league territories. But no, Dennis was unique. The way that he could combine the incredible accuracy, and then of course he had that entertainment value with what has become known as Comettiisms, and a lot of people can recite many of them. But yeah, he was a very giving person. I've never ever heard anybody, and obviously Dennis, we were very proud of him here in Western Australia because he strode the national stage, and, for many times he would have been approached by Seven, lesser by Nine, to actually make the move and base himself in Victoria. But, he continued to fly. And in the end of the day, that was the flying that ended Dennis's career. He kept calling for Triple M radio for a further 5 years here in Western Australia. And the last game he ever called was the COVID Grand Final at Optus Stadium, where Melbourne beat the Western Bulldogs, and that was the last game he ever did. So it was a lot of the times I would stand next to Dennis sometimes when I travelled out of Western Australia to do matches, and we'd be on the same flight there and back, and often you'd be standing next to him at the baggage carousel, and he would make a comment about the arduous nature of flying probably 8, 10 years before he actually retired. I saw a stat, I don't know how accurate it was, but he travelled roughly 2 million kilometres in his career back and forth across the country. And, that would include going to Olympic Games and doing Test cricket for the ABC. So, yeah, he was a true ornament. Not surprisingly, the WA state government, not a state funeral, but they are going to provide, as they did for John Todd recently, a state memorial service, and it will be a who's who of Western Australian sport, and the premier, the governor, and just a lot of footy fans and sports fans will be there to honour a great life.
As well as being a great commentator, people forget that he knew the game well, having been a player. I mean, again, I never saw him play. I knew that he tried out at Footscray in the VFL when he was over here working for 3DB Music before they changed to racing in the 1970s. But he could obviously play, Glenn, and he was the coach as well. And not only when he coached West Perth, he would also mix that job in with calling at the ABC when West Perth weren't playing matches.
Yeah, he did a deal with George Grusius that most people probably wouldn't get actually through the door. Dan, it was a remarkable time. Yeah, he was a talented player. He made his debut in 1967. He played 38 games, but in the 1968 Waffle season, he kicked 63 goals. Now, he played 20 games, getting up around 3.5 goals a game. And that was, of course, well before the West Coast Eagles. So, that was a premier competition. There were a lot of great starters that were playing. So to kick 63 goals in a season was a fair effort. His first introduction, if you like, to footy calling was quite a fascinating one. That he was over here working at a music station and got a call from Melbourne because there was a state game being played in Western Australia. And the gentleman on the other end of the phone from Melbourne asked whether there were any football callers there. And Dennis said, "Oh, yeah, I can do it." He'd never actually called a game, but he slotted in and did it. Obviously knew all the West Australian players, and by dint of a program like the Winners, he knew a lot of the Victorian players. That's where it all started for him. But a lot of people forget that he could have easily been the voice of Australian summer. We refer to, quite rightly, Jim Maxwell as being the voice of Australian summer in particular nowadays, with the long-time passing of Richie Benaud. But in 1985, when Alan McGilvray did his last Ashes tour in England, the ABC sent Dennis. I mean, he was getting on in years, Alan, but Dennis was there to sort of chaperone him and, help him out, on the understanding that Dennis would actually become the next Alan McGilvray. He would have actually been in the position that went to Jim Maxwell. But Dennis's love of Australian football was the thing that took him from the ABC, and he went to Seven. And when I say love of football, Dan, I can remember being in the International Broadcast Centre, and I bumped into Dennis in Atlanta, and this would have been probably about 3 days into the Olympic competition. And he was bemoaning the fact that he was there and he just wanted to get home and call footy. Right. So whilst at that games, he had the very memorable call on the final night of swimming of the gold medals of Perkins and O'Neill. But for him, despite the great work he did in cricket and NBL, swimming, football was the closest thing to his heart. And that is why he dedicated so much of his professional career to the sport of Australian football.
Was football the one that was so closest to him because he played the game, because he probably knew it the best, even though if you listen to him, as you say, calling the other sports, you would have thought he was an expert in those as well?
Yeah, I mean, he freely admitted that cricket wasn't his sport because, surname Cometti came from a strong Italian background, and growing up, cricket really wasn't on his sporting diet. So he really had to work hard to teach himself the nuances and the history of the game, whereas for football, it was a sport that was innate to him, and he did play it. He had a tremendously close relationship with his late father. His father, took him to football matches. An incredibly sad story. Dennis was actually on the training track at West Perth when he was called aside by a relative on a Tuesday or Thursday night to tell him that his father had passed away. And they were two inseparable people. As Dennis grew up, they would always be travelling around the various waffle grounds here in Perth and taking in the Saturday afternoon action. Dennis grew up barracking for East Fremantle, even though he played his footy for West Perth. But yeah, he was an incredible broadcaster. He was somewhat of a quirky individual as well. He had a fascination, an absolute fascination with the JFK assassination.
Did he really?
so many books on it. He watched docos on it. And in fact, on his many visits to the United States, at one stage he went to New Orleans and actually met Jim Garrison. Now, Jim Garrison was the New Orleans district attorney who actually brought the only legal case to court in regard to the assassination of Kennedy. There was a court case that involved Clay Shaw, who was the head of the trademark, which is where Kennedy was heading on the fateful day, 22nd of November back in 63, heading through Dallas, Texas. But Dennis actually met with Jim Garrison. He actually wrote the book which inspired the Oliver Stone film, JFK. So Dennis loved that. He had an incredibly eclectic music, I guess, spectrum. He was very heavily involved in indie music. He actually brought a group over to Australia.
Did he really?
Called McKenna, and they performed at one of the AFL Grand Finals. And Dennis sort of told people that they could be the next Beatles, but alas for Dennis, it was same as Molly Meldrum. He said the knack would be after my Sharona would be the next Beatles. It didn't really turn out that way, but no, he had a love of music. The interesting thing is too that in the very early days of his broadcasting career, he picked up a lot of videotapes and had them sent over from the United States. So Dennis based himself a lot on American broadcasters and did pick up also little sayings that he would then sort of be able to mould into Australian football. But yeah, back in those days, before pay TV and, ESPN and Fox America and things like that, he was probably one of the very few people in Australia that actually was able to watch NBA and NFL because he had people over there that would post him VHS tapes. They might be a fortnight late when they got here, but he would sit down and study them. So he had a terrific love at the end of each season, virtually within a day or two of the end of the AFL season, he would be on a plane with his wife, V, and go across to America and spend many weeks there. And the whole holiday was based around going to sporting events. His love of American sport, NFL. In fact, in West Perth, when he was coaching West Perth,
yes,
they changed their name from the Cardinals to the Falcons because when Dennis was at the club as a coach of West Perth, he went to Atlanta and spent some time with the Atlanta Falcons, the NFL team there. And when he came back, he persuaded his great mate, Rod Brown, the president of West Perth, to actually change the name of the club. So they became the West Perth Falcons in the Waffle, where for 80 plus years they'd been the West Perth Cardinals. So he was a man that loved his American sport and loved his Australian sport, in particular footy.
Glenn Mitchell is with me talking about Dennis Cometti and all other things. He's an oracle when it comes to sport, one of the great sports commentators of all time. He's part of Dashing Dan's Sporting Adventures for Breeny Brothers Brewery, great brewers of beer. You can get them on www.breenybros.com, and a shout out to the brothers, James and also Justin. Glenn, you talked before about the person who was on the other end of the phone when Dennis sort of got his first chance by accident to call football. Do you know who that gentleman was?
Was it Ian Major?
It was Ian Major. Yeah, it certainly was. And Mage, who was a fairly shy and retiring type away from the microphone as well, lovely man. Bulldog support a lot, myself and Dennis as well. So a great man, Glenn. But he actually has told people quietly that he helped discover Dennis Cometti by making that call that day.
Yeah, pretty much launched his career. I don't know that Dennis would have stayed as a DJ. I'm sure he always had aspirations to call sport, even from his early teenage years. But yeah, it was a fateful call, and Dennis told a fairly significant porky, as it turned out, that he didn't have any experience as a broadcaster, but he obviously got in there and did particularly well. And as I say, the rest is history. He went on to create a career which is, I think it would be fair to say that we've never had a better AFL caller. Bruce has been outstanding. Tim Lane, who I've always credited as being an outstanding commentator, but, no matter how you look at it, football is a bigger medium on television than it is on radio.
Yeah.
And Dennis, had the golden voice as well, which was something that he was genetically blessed with. But yeah, one of the great careers. And as I said, I really have never come across anyone that has been an anti-Cometti person. I mean, without being unkind, there have been people that have said, Bruce gushes a little bit too much or whatever. I don't subscribe to that theory by any means. There have been some people that, mightn't like Ray Warren's commentary. But I can never, ever remember anyone ever saying that they didn't like Dennis Cometti as a commentator. And, I think in the media, perhaps more so in radio, but in television, a large deal, you almost become a member of people's extended families. So, Dennis was invited into people's houses every Friday night. He also did Sunday afternoon games. People would have listened to him on the ABC broadcasting Test cricket when they're out on the harvester in regional areas of Australia for many years. So for a lot of people, I was actually in hospital having a minor procedure done. My wife rang me about 7 o'clock in the morning. I knew Dennis hadn't been well, but it still shocked me that, at 76, he's left us. But one of the great things, Dan, many people can leave this mortal coil and they can be missed, and you've got a memory. But with Dennis, you've actually got something that you can go back and listen to. And, we will turn on our children, our grandchildren will turn the TV on and they will hear the dulcet tones of Dennis Cometti. So in some ways that is I guess, something for people to be able to soften the grief, if you like, that they'll always be able to go on YouTube or whatever and have a listen to Dennis in his prime.
Was told early days by great broadcasters like yourself and Tim Lane that calling football in particular on television and radio needs to be different. Now, Dennis called it the same way on radio and television, and he described every single piece of action. You could see it in front of you on the television, but I think it added to it. And as you say, Glenn, I don't think anyone minded too much that he gave you a lot of information because it was magnificent information, wasn't it?
It was, and he was incredibly well researched. Dennis would spend hour upon hour looking at videotape. Like most commentators, he prided himself on player identification, and on a Friday night, you can't afford to make a mistake. But he would take a briefcase full of statistics with him, but he would spend many, many hours. He actually lived the entirety of his life in the one house, pretty much. He was born in Geraldton, but his house in Yokine, in the sort of an inner suburb of Perth, just north of Perth, all he did was put a second story on the family house where he lived with his mum and dad, and he lived there the entire time. And he had Dennis's den, and where he had all his videotapes, and he could sit there and just do his statistical homework and watch video. But yeah, he was an incredibly well-prepared commentator, perhaps more so known by a lot of people in regard to the Comettiisms.
Yes.
Some of them were well and truly thought out in advance. In fact, he told me one day that he used to keep pad and pencil on his bedside table.
Yes.
So if he ever woke up in the middle of the night and something dawned on him, he'd write it down in case he forgot about it by the morning. But, he was incredibly quick-witted, because there were at times things would play out in front of him where you could tell that it wasn't something that had been rehearsed or stored in his mind to use at an opportune time when the stars aligned on a football field. But yeah, he had the gift of accuracy, entertainment, voice quality, the Cometti-isms, the little asides. He was the quintessential perfect broadcaster.
We were always taught to capture the moment. You were very good at it. Tim, outstanding at it. Dennis was probably second to none, correct?
Oh, no doubt. I mean, the Susie O'Neill, the heart of a lion and the heart of Dixie.
Yeah, magnificent.
The commentary of Kieran Perkins, this is gold, a rare type of gold. I was lucky. I was actually at the venue with a lot of ABC commentators that night that weren't working in Atlanta, and was able to sit there in the stand and watch that race, and then to watch back Dennis's commentary and the way that he compiled it was quite something. Yeah, and the big moments in football, kicks after the siren, the very famous Boyd one in 2016, which way will the ball bounce, the stadium holds its breath. He was incredibly gifted, a great wordsmith, and so much allied to that, I think, Dan, was his voice. He had just an incredibly mellifluous voice that people just loved listening to. It didn't grate at all. And as Bruce McAvaney said in one of his tributes, he always had somewhere else to go. He could raise excitement. His voice never cracked. It never broke. Yeah, he was blessed with so many natural talents, but through hard work and dedication, he made the most of those and turned himself into, or arguably, the most popular broadcaster this country has ever had.
It's an ego-driven industry. Glenn, I certainly know it. I think there are some people that have massive egos, and maybe, just my humble opinion here, the ego doesn't possessed the same amount of talent. But Dennis was such a nice guy. I mean, you got a chance to get to know him, and he was just like a normal person and always friendly, always giving. And I never had the pleasure to broadcast with him, but I got to know him quite a bit, and he was so nice.
Well, there was a famous photo going around, or a well-known photo going around social media after his passing of him being outside the commentary box at Subiaco Oval, and he had two fans alongside him because the two fans wanted a photo with him. The photo was actually being taken by Brian Lake, an AFL apprenticeship player. So the fans actually wanted a photo of the commentator and not someone who actually played in a successful premiership team. He was an interesting character in that he was extremely giving to the public, and he loved. Well, I wouldn't say loved being recognised. Is probably the wrong way of putting it. He was never ever short with people. He never ever turned away an opportunity if someone asked for an autograph or a selfie with him. However, an example, as I said, when I used to travel sometimes with him, and it became obvious after a while, and I did actually speak to him about it once. Often when a plane landed at the Perth airport or Melbourne, Dennis would go into the toilets and would virtually wait until he knew that everyone had cleared away from the baggage carousel, and he would then go out and get his case that was rotating around the carousel.
Yeah.
He was, like a lot of people in the media, seen as being incredibly gregarious, but there was a degree of shyness in regard to Dennis. And he was one of those commentators, I think, also that never necessarily got overly close to anyone that he was broadcasting, by dint of the fact that I think that he felt that, if I did get too close, I might pull my punches when someone's out of form or they transgress on the football field and are on report. And you think, well, I better sugarcoat my commentary here because he's a good bloke and I don't want him seeing suspended on Tuesday night at a tribunal. But yeah, he was one of those people that you often find in the media that outwardly you think they're very gregarious, but on the inside they actually do have a fair degree of shyness to them.
Yeah, I noticed that a little bit with him as well. But as I say, he was always a very friendly person to speak to. Just in regard to his cricket, Glenn, he was a great cricket commentator. I'll never forget the last day. It was one of the great days of Test cricket, 1981, Australia and the West Indies. Kim Hughes had made one of his best Test hundreds on a horrible wicket against a very good attack. And Dennis called the last ball of the day when Lilly was on fire, got Croft out, the night watchman. They were three for not many, and he got Richards out, and he said, Richards goes for the drive bowled. I thought that was as good a piece of cricket commentary as I've ever heard, and I've heard some wonderful cricket commentators over the years, and you're right, he could have kept doing that if he wanted to.
Oh, undoubtedly, he would have kept doing it. He wouldn't have had the, not being unkind, he wouldn't have had the depth of knowledge that someone like Jim Maxwell does have, because Jim, like Dennis, was just so wrapped up in Australian football. Jim was and is wrapped up in the sport of cricket. But yeah, he very famously also, Dennis, called I think it was 82, 83, called that juggle catch.
Yes.
When Australia, when on the last day when the Border and Thompson were trying to edge Australia to victory and lost by 3 runs, he was behind the mic on that day for the ABC as well. So yeah, he was an incredibly talented person. There's no doubt about that. And, as I said at the beginning, Dan, that I can't think of another commentator that would pass. And we know what social media is like, even in the worst of times, when a lot of people, often 95% of people are grieving and making nice comments, 5% of people who are trolls will come on and just make what is a rather perverse comment. I didn't see anything. I did not see one comment that belittled Dennis Cometti. And in our industry, everybody, when I say our industry, broadcast, I don't just necessarily mean sport, but you can be a news presenter, you can be a current affairs journalist, you can be, host a cooking show or whatever. You can have a lot of people that think you're the ant's pants, but you'll always see on social media people that don't like them. And Dennis, certainly when he passed, absolutely nothing. In Perth, there was a 16-page wraparound on Saturday morning in the West Australian. 16 pages.
16.
Now, I don't...
Wow.
Yep. I can't remember. I would say in Western Australia, the only time we may have seen more than a 16-page wraparound would have been when Queen Elizabeth died. There was a lot of coverage when John Todd died.
Yeah.
He was given a state memorial service. We have had other great West Australians pass away. Maybe Bob Hawke, he could have got 16 pages, but Dennis got a 16-page wraparound on a Saturday morning West Australian just gone. Now that gives you an idea of how proud this state was of him, but also just the impact that he had on the general community.
I watched something recently, and I didn't have the pleasure of going to the funeral. I know you did, of the late great Walter John Foreman, and Dennis did one of the eulogies, and Glenn Wally's son posted it on Facebook. And you mentioned earlier about Dennis being so close to his dad, and of course his father dying suddenly of a heart attack. We know that's what happened to Wally, and he was very close to Mark, who was young at the time, and also Glenn. And Dennis, you could tell, knew exactly what to say at the right time after he told a few jokes at Wally's expense. And then at the very end, the way he gave advice to both Glenn and Mark just indicated what a very special person he was. And obviously he'd lived the same way, hadn't he, in regard to his father's death?
Oh, no doubt about that. And so, yeah, you would say that he had lived experience, even though Mark in particular was a lot younger than Dennis was when his father passed away. But yeah, he was one of the other great things, and this isn't always the case in the media. He was a terrific mentor. He would receive tapes from a lot of young broadcasters or aspiring broadcasters and would be very, very happy to listen to them or watch them and give feedback. So he was very giving in that regard. Yeah, he was an incredible person. I knew him probably reasonably loosely up until 2006. And then 1996. So my first 6 years at the ABC. And then when George Goodisich left the ABC to go to commercial radio, station 6BR here in Perth, I got a phone call from Dennis Cometti. And I answered the phone and he said, "Oh, how you going? Blah, blah, blah." I said, "Good, Dan." And I was thinking, I wonder why he's running me out of the blue. And he said, "Are you looking for anyone to do Saturday Sports Talk?" which was the program that George hosted. Dennis actually started that program.
Right.
With Wally Foreman. It's an institution in WA. It still goes
It is
10 till 12 every Saturday morning throughout winter. And we're talking about a program now that has been around for you'd be up around 50 years now, in fact, a little bit more than that. But yeah, Dennis offered to come on board. So for 2 years, Dennis was with us on the ABC on Saturday mornings. And that's when I got to know him a lot more. And then, I'd bump into him a lot after that. But yeah, he was an incredibly giving broadcaster. But yeah, I mean, I don't know, in America, maybe another country where it's happened, but, there was a book that was brought out by a third party that was just Comettiisms. It was, a small book, smaller than like A5, but sold well. And it just had all his humorous bits of commentary. And I know I saw comments from Heath Shaw, trying to think who the others were that were talking. Oh, Peter Wilson, the cork in the ocean.
Yes.
Heath Shaw obviously came up behind, Reebok like a librarian.
Well,
And actually talked about the fact that, and Bruce made a good comment, Bruce McAvaney, that Dennis in some ways actually made footballers more famous than they were.
Yeah.
Because that one act of Peter Wilson and of Heath Shaw, a lot of people would say that, Peter Wilson, premiership player, played for Richmond, played for West Coast. Heath Shaw, 300 odd games of footy. If you spoke to anyone and mentioned Peter Wilson or Heath Shaw, the things that would be remembered were because of the Dennis Cometti commentary. So Bruce was quite right. In some ways, Dennis's way of commentating and the way he could put a turn of phrase in that people would remember actually elevated the memory of some footballers in the general footballing community and the public that follows footy. So it gives you an idea of the uniqueness of Dennis behind the microphone.
Got Glenn Mitchell with us here on Dashing Dan's Sporting Adventures for Brenny Brothers Brewery, and they're great pioneers of the Australian brewing industry, having first started brewing in Williamstown in 1864. They produce a range of easy drinking mainstream beers that are based on a family recipe from over 100 years ago. He was a Western Bulldog supporter or Footscray supporter, but like yourself and Drew Morfitt and a few others, kept that pretty quiet. We only really found that out when we heard that he actually played footy for Footscray, as I mentioned a bit earlier, and it was rather fitting that his last call on television was the Bulldogs winning that premiership.
Yeah, and as it turned out, to completely flip that, the last one he ever called was a Bulldogs loss in the grand final. So his last two grand finals. And again, to give you an idea, Dan, of how giving he was, I saw the footage of it only on social media. I've seen it several times in the last week. That he, pardon me, he called the grand final at Optus 2021, the COVID grand final. He knew it had been announced beforehand that would be his last game of footy ever. And he was calling with Lockie Reeve, who's a sports presenter on Channel 10, and called for that radio station, Triple M. And Lockie had been a lifelong Melbourne supporter.
Right.
With about 90 seconds left in the game, there was a stoppage, and Dennis said, "Lockie, this is your moment, over to you." And Dennis just sat back and allowed Lockie to, knowing the game was well and truly over, that Melbourne on the final siren were going to win. But, it just exemplified the sort of bloke Dennis was, that, he called the finishes of grand finals before. And who knows? I mean, Lockie, based in WA, it might be the only chance he ever had of calling a grand final siren, and it involved the team that he passionately followed. So Dennis virtually handballed the microphone to him. So, another sign of just what sort of person Dennis was as a team player, as part of a broadcast team.
Now, Glenn, you retired last year. When a great like Dennis Cometti retires, does it gird your loins to think that I miss it? Or does it just make you think that I've had a great career and I can sit back and remember people like Dennis Cometti?
Oh, I think the latter. I mean, I must admit, I really don't think about my broadcasting career now. It's rarely that it actually comes across my mind. I mean, I left the ABC 15 years ago. After that, I still did some test cricket on radio for another network, and I did AFL footy up until 2024. But largely, I was semi-retired as a broadcaster, a football commentator, a sports commentator for quite some time. Really, the only thing I have nowadays, unless someone recognise me and asks a question or whatever, it's mainly just my son, in particular, watching Test cricket. He'll sort of say, "Oh, Dad, have you been to that ground or whatever?" And I'll sort of say, "Oh, yeah, I've commentated there in whatever year or whatever." But yeah, I don't really think about my broadcasting career, and I know that Dennis was very much at ease with his retirement. As I said initially, sort of retirement number one, if you could say, in 2016 when he walked away from television, and then in 2021 when he walked away from radio, which brought about an entire end to his broadcasting career. And he was very comfortable with it. It allowed him to travel a lot more. I mean, he had a great love of travel. And as I said, America was his favourite destination. I'd hate to think of how many times he went there. His son, Mark, was a professional wrestler.
Yes, he was.
And Mark, that was one of the great things that in Dennis's latter years at Triple M, Mark was the statistician in the box. So, I mean, that was a wonderful thing that he was able to end his career working in the same commentary box as his son. But he was very close to Mark, very close to Ricky, his daughter. And even though time has passed now, Ben, sympathies are still with the family. He was married to V for so many years. But yeah, he was a creature of habit. Had the same taxi driver in Melbourne that always picked him up.
Did he really?
Yeah, I think his name was Raj. He had
Right.
the same. Yeah, so Dennis would let him know on. Well, I suppose it was pretty much a prescribed thing for all the time he was doing Friday.
Yeah.
Night footy, he'd arrive on the same flight, but Raj would be there. Raj would pick him up from the ground, or pick him up from the hotel, take him to the ground, take him from the ground to the hotel, and then drive him back to the airport whenever he came back on a Sunday evening. So he was a bit of a creature of habit. He stayed often in not the same hotel, stayed in the same hotel room in Melbourne. But yeah, I mean, it's, as I said, one of the great things is that, unlike so many people, Dennis will live on in a lot of people go and they live on in people's memories, and that's all you've got. You might have photos and things like that, but by dint of what Dennis did, you can go on YouTube today or in 10 years or in 25 years, or if someone mentions in 45 years' time, "Oh, God, he's a good commentator, but you should have heard Dennis Cometti." People can go on who've never heard him and think, "Crikey, I can see why people said that." So at any time when people have, without being to use a terminology, have a withdrawal symptom that Dennis is no longer with us,
Yeah.
you can always go back and access his voice and access his work and his humour, and that is a great thing for all of us.
Glenn Mitchell is with me talking about Dennis Cometti, and we'll get to some other things to do with sport at the moment. I know, as he said, he has retired. He's not thinking about his magnificent sporting career or sports broadcasting career, which he should and other people should, because it was as good as Dennis Cometti's, in my humble opinion. But we're here for Breeny Brothers Brewery, dashing down sporting adventures, and they produce a range of easy drinking mainstream beers that are based on a family recipe from over 100 years ago. They're an Australian-owned family business run by the brothers James and also Justin. Now, Glenn, how do you know when it's time to retire? I've obviously had some mental health issues. I'd love to keep doing something. When it comes to broadcasting, footy opportunities are starting to not be there as often as they were a few years ago. How do you know when it's time to retire?
I always said to myself, Dan, probably, I don't know, maybe when I left the ABC, what was I, 48 then? I always said to myself that because I'd left full-time broadcasting, well, when I say full-time, 5 days a week with the ABC, always said to myself that when I don't feel that I want to do the preparation that I normally do, I'll give it away. And it got to that stage. Dennis was one who flying was the thing that ended his career. For me, it was just doing the preparation. I loved calling with the people I did, but I just knew that watching the videotape, sitting down on a Friday night, writing out the stats and everything, and I knew that I could still go on air. And I mean, of all the stuff I always prepared, and I'd like to think I was always very diligent in regard to preparation. Like most people that are diligent, they use about 2% of it on game day. So I could have easily kept going, commentating and not doing all that during the week, but I always made a commitment to myself that, I would feel that I'd be shortchanging myself. So in some ways, I probably should have given it away a season earlier, because in 2024, we're only about 4 or 5 weeks into the season. I come home and say to my wife, I don't know why I've done this again. So I got through to the end of that year and was very much at peace in giving it away. I realised I'd done it for 35 years to that point, and yeah, it was time just to walk off into the sunset and let a lot of very outstanding young broadcasters have their time.
If you're in a situation, though, where, and I hope you don't mind me asking a question about myself here, where the opportunities are not coming, you've also got to read the room as well, don't you?
Well, you do. You do. I mean, everybody has a shelf life in any job. There are a lot of people around the world that freelance, and I'm not just talking about the media. They're consultants or whatever.
Yes.
And after a period of time, I mean, to use a classic example, Dan, I left the ABC and it was well known, and I don't mind talking about it because I had a mental breakdown. I was then diagnosed with bipolar and I made a suicide attempt.
Yes.
In the first 5 or 6 years after I left the ABC, I was inundated with requests to do speaking engagements, whether it be corporate, whether it to go out to, a drought-riddled town in Western Australia where they were having a lot of issues and perhaps, suicides amongst farmers and everything like that. And after a period of time, that dried up because, my time had come and gone. There were other people that were more current in the news that had suffered what I did. So, in the end, I still do a little bit now, but they're all referrals. It's, someone might have changed company and they're doing a staff development day and they say, oh, mental health, get Glenn Mitchell because I saw him when I was working for so-and-so. So everyone does have a shelf life. And, if you're a freelancer, yeah, I mean, sometimes people just stop knocking at the door. And you have to understand that, not everybody can be at the forefront of people's minds forever and a day. And I think if you believe that, then your ego is sort of getting ahead of everything else in life. That yeah, everyone has a shelf life, and I certainly did in that area in regard to. And I don't hold any bitterness. I don't think, God, the phone hasn't rung. I just understand that's the reason why. But there's a lot more people in the last 15 years since I had my breakdown that have had breakdowns that have been publicised that have a profile. So why wouldn't people automatically think, oh, let's go and get X, and forgotten about Glenn Mitchell? And I had no issue and I had a total understanding in life of why that happens.
Do you think that because, not so much you, but I know it's me, that I've been very open about my mental health, that people have stayed away because they're nervous, and they do stay away from people who have been honest with their mental health issues, even though they can do the job, no matter what that job might be? And does that concern you a bit?
I think it's changed a lot nowadays. I think a lot of people are being given second chances. I think a lot of people nowadays, Dan, are being given second chances across the board, but perhaps in times going by that they wouldn't. And I think there are still, some people, and I won't mention them, that are in the media that have been perhaps done things extremely untoward, that media outlets are still employing them.
Yeah.
I mean, a different example I'll use in regard to that, because what I was talking about before is in regard to abuse of women, for example. That is something that is incredibly abhorrent now in Australian mainstream society. Yet there are still people that, have been given a second chance with that. The classic here in Western Australia is Ben Cousins. I mean,
Yes.
Ben's life was in total turmoil, and I think everyone that was close to Ben, and as I said, if you're a West Coast Eagles supporter, Ben's like a brother-in-law because the fascination and the love that people have for their football team. But Ben's life was completely off the rails. But he was given a second chance. He has read the sports news on Channel 7. He is back on commercial radio here. In actual fact, I saw advertised he's going to be doing a stage, for want of a better term, on a stage production where he's going to get up and talk about his life, completely, no holds barred. So I think people are far more forgiving in those areas nowadays. And I think in Ben's case, terrific. He has rebuilt his life. And I think the people that have backed him have done a terrific job by getting behind him. And I think the same with mental health nowadays. I think far more people now are being given a second chance. And, my rationale, what I've always said to people is that I see the word or the two words mental illness, the most important word is illness.
Yes.
You can have diabetes, you can be recovering from leukemia, and a lot of people will also say, Dan, that, well, quite rightly, alcoholism, gambling, and illicit drug use, to a large degree, are also three illnesses. So I think we're getting away from the era now where people hear mental illness. Oh, geez, mental, what's wrong with him? I think nowadays we are becoming far more forgiving as a society, and I think that is a wonderful thing. And I think it's wonderful too that, over time, Dan, we've seen, people as high profile as Lance Franklin, someone like James Packer. People would look at James Packer and Lance Franklin and think, God, wish I had your life. I mean, money's not an issue. In Lance Franklin's case, he was married or is married to a supermodel. He was playing AFL footy, the adulation, and yet he was willing to publicly say, hey, what you see on a footy field is not necessarily what's happening in my head for the other, 166 hours of the week. So I think that is normalising it. I think that's wonderful.
Can I just ask a question about Ben Cousins? And this may be an unpopular view. Has he had more than a second chance? I would argue he's had 4, 5, 6 chances. Look, good on him. He's got that opportunity. I'm a bit uncomfortable that he's been given that opportunity. Am I the only one that has that view, or do you think there are others out there, Glenn, that has that view? I don't think he should have got that opportunity because he went through such a bad stage in his life and there was repeat poor behaviours.
Yeah, I would disagree with that, and reasonably strongly, Dan. I don't have an issue with that. I mean, in many ways there, if you like, Ben was destroying his own life. If you are talking about other things where people have broken the law or broken societal laws, more moral laws, where other people have been greatly impacted and traumatised. I know that Ben's family was traumatised, but there's a different sort of issue to doing other things. I don't have any issue at all with Ben coming back, and perhaps at the end of the day, for him to realise that people were happy to have him back in the general fold, then I think maybe that might have been one of the aiding processes in him being able to get to the state that he's in today. So no, I don't have any issue at all with the way that people have supported him and the way that he has been able to turn his life around. Not at all.
I mean, I've got nothing against Ben Cousins. It's just an opinion I have that I thought he's had a lot of chances, but okay. I mean, you're closer to it than I am, being in Western Australia myself in Melbourne. But when I saw him get that opportunity, I thought, oh, does he deserve it? But maybe when I think about it, he's taken it now and he's got his life back on track. Glenn, can I just ask you some general sporting questions? No doubt you still follow the sport, as you said. You'll sit with James, your son, and watch the cricket. How do you reckon the cricket team is going, considering it remains very old?
Oh, well, transition is going to be something that's a major issue. In fact, it's interesting that we've had a major retirement in the last week or so announced earlier than that, Alyssa Healy.
Yes.
And I was sort of thinking about how well placed the Australian women's cricket program is. I mean, there have been three main pillars: Lanning, Healy, and Perry. Now, I know that there are other great players like Ash Gardner, and you've also got Beth Mooney, Alana King. But at the moment, you look at Litchfield and Hamilton, you've got players that are waiting in the wings to come into the Australian women's cricket system at the highest level, international level. I'm not too sure that in the men's ranks we necessarily have that. I think also you've got to keep in mind that if we look at, and this is a little bit like the Ponting War era, if you look at this modern day era, Nathan Lyon, Josh Hazlewood, Pat Cummins, Mitchell Stark, obviously Steve Smith, they're five that are going to be automatically in the Australian Cricket Hall of Fame. So you're looking at replacing, and in the end, Travis Head and Alex Carey may get there as well. So you're looking at replacing Hall of Fame cricketers, and that is not an easy thing to do, out of one particular era. I was looking the other day that, what does fascinate me is that we got one round of Shield cricket away from the end of the season. And I looked at the batting statistics for this current Sheffield Shield season. And when you look at the leading run getters, there are a lot of them in the top five, top six, that are actually averaging under 40 for the season. Mm. And I just cast an eye back 25 years. I went back to the season of 2000, 2001. And there was, off the top of my head, there was Kadich, Blewett, Marr, Cox, and Hodge for the five. And they were all averaging 55 and above for the season. And Kadich was averaging over 70. Mm. So it's an interesting one that, that you think that back in that era, Jimmy Marr never got to play cricket, test cricket for Australia. Simon Kadich spent a lot of time in the domestic system. Brad Hodge played a handful of tests, and Jamie Cox never played test cricket. No. So they were players that were playing regular Sheffield Shield cricket and were averaging 55 plus for the season. We've got a lot of players this year, obviously, that have played a full Shield season, whether it be a Sam Constas, who's in the top five of the aggregate, whether it be McSweeney or people like that, and yet they are nowhere near. So if you then roll that into replacing a Steve Smith replacing a Kawaja, replacing a Steve Smith, and in short haul, you're going to have to replace fast bowlers. I mean, the leading fast bowler in the Sheffield Shield competition this year was a bloke that plays at my son's cricket club at Claremont Nedlands here, Cameron Gammer. He's got 38 wins for the season. He's 36 years of age. He's the leading Shield wicket taker in the country. So you're not going to look to him to be the next fast bowler. So yeah, I think there are major issues. Whereas in women's cricket, for whatever the system that they built up there, Lanning, the captaincy went to Healy. The captaincy will now go to Molyneux. You've got Hamilton, Litchfield, these young players that are coming in and being blooded. Look at Annabelle Sutherland, who's only 24. Yeah. The transition process in women's cricket seems to be far brighter than what it is in men's.
How are we going to remember Alyssa Healy? One of the all-time greats?
Oh, definitely. I mean, she'll be a Hall of Fame member, the same as a Belinda Clark and a Meg Lanning, and we're going to see Perry go in there as well. 299 internationals. Do you know how many Mitch Stark, her husband's played?
299? Yeah.
300.
300?
There's only one game between them, and most people would know also they both have a highest test score of 99.
Yes, but, they do.
And I think one of the great things is that, if you look at the sport of Australian football, you can be a great player, but if you win a Norm Smith medal, all of a sudden you are elevated to another status. And if you win multiple Norm Smith medals, like a Luke Hodge or an Andrew McLeod, you are elevated to another level. Alyssa Healy's performances in matches that truly mattered is quite staggering. I mean, you go back to the 2020, the historic game at the MCG, the T20 final there, where there were nearly 90,000 people watching an Australian women's sporting event. And the way that she played there, the 75 she made off 39 balls. And then 2 years later, in the final of the one-day Women's International World Cup in Christchurch in New Zealand against England, she made 170.
Yeah.
So she was someone that when it came to the big moment, she was able to perform. And I think that is the real sign, I think, of a truly great player, is when it's on the line. If it's an AFL, NRL grand final, if it's an Olympic final and you put in a personal best, even if you mightn't win the gold, but that is the best performance to that point of time of your career, to reel off 170, first male or female to ever score over 150 in a 50-over World Cup final. And she really just iced the game. She put the game beyond the opposition in that T20 World Cup final at the MCG. She will go down in history, Dan, as one of the finest cricketers this country has ever produced. And one of the other things, too, about her is that she has been at the forefront, given how long she's been playing,
Yes.
to change the whole nature of women's cricket. Correct. And the way it's looked upon now. I mean, overnight, we had the first ever auction in the women's 100 competition in England. Beth Mooney went to her team, the Trent Rockets at Trent Bridge, Birmingham, for 400,000 Australian dollars.
Wow.
Now, when Alyssa Healy started her career, alongside Lanning and Perry 12, 15 years ago, if someone had said to you, I reckon by the time Healy retires, there'll be players getting paid $400,000 to play franchise cricket. The IPL was up and running then, so was the BBL. People would have said, you're mad. So she's also been at the forefront of actually developing the sport and turning it into an incredibly full-time professional sport where, if Beth Mooney's earning 400,000 there, she's earning 200 at least from Cricket Australia. She'll play a couple of other leagues. You're talking about a lady there that's earning north of $750,000 this year.
A lot of money.
When Alyssa Healy, when she started her career, Alyssa Healy, that would have been a pipe dream for anybody. Even the staunchest administrators of women's cricket would have thought that's never going to happen.
It certainly changed. Legendary broadcaster Glenn Mitchell has joined me. We've talked about Dennis Cometti. We're talking about the state of Australian cricket. We're here for Brinny Brothers Brewery, Australian-owned family business. Profits stay in Australia as opposed to many top-selling beer brands that are foreign-owned on Dashing Dan's sporting adventures. Glenn, you touched before about the best averages for the Sheffield Shield cricket players this year in the 30s. Are you a bit concerned about the standard of batting? I know South Africa are a very good test side. They're the reigning test champions. Their bowlers are magnificent, but not too many of their batters are averaging 40. Certainly Bavuma's improved as a player since he's become captain, and he's close to 40 along with Markram, but the rest mid-30s at best. And a lot of those English guys outside Brook and Root are only averaging mid-30s as well. Are you a bit concerned by that?
Yeah, well, Brook's actually the anomaly, if you like, because I have most people, and I would be a strong subscriber to it, that the shorter form of the game in franchise cricket has changed the way that batters go about their task. I mean, Brook to average in the mid-50s and the way that he plays T20 cricket in particular and white ball cricket. But I think there is no doubt that the amount of time that players are focusing now, I'll give you a classic example. My son is 20 now, and I reckon he was about probably, 10 years of age. And I enrolled him in, and he wanted to do it, I enrolled him in a 6-week during the winter coaching program. It was put on by some very good coaches, and they had some first-class cricketers there that were helping out. And I was there with another group of fathers, and we were there watching. It was in an indoor centre at night and midweek during winter. And the first session that my son was there, and all the other boys, the first session was spent on sweeping, reverse sweep, slog sweep, ramping. And I'm thinking, and we were talking amongst ourselves, the fathers, and saying, we must be dinosaurs. Because, my way of thinking is that, okay, let's develop a technique so you can keep the good ball out. And then from there, if you're still in, you can play a lot of shots. Completely the opposite way now. Young kids are taught to be extremely aggressive from ball one. And most kids now will watch BBL and T20 World Cups ahead of watching Test cricket. So what they're seeing in front of them is this form of cricket where it's, pedal to the metal. And I think that does have a massive outcome that players aren't used to concentrating. If you're a middle order batter in T20, so you're talking about 120 balls in an innings, you might go in and there's 52 balls left, of which, even if you hold the strike, you might get to face 33 of them. That's your afternoon. In Test cricket, you're going to face 33 balls probably about, an hour or 40 minutes before you get to lunch.
Correct.
Then you're expected about after lunch till tea, and if you're an opener, you should still be there after tea. So it doesn't surprise me that we're seeing around the world. There are standouts like a Smith or a Root, but I think otherwise, and the other thing is, the massive threat, Dan, for cricket is franchise cricket. Again, my son plays at the same club, Claremont Netherlands here in Perth, as Tim David. And Tim is really the first player in Australia that has come through the modern day career path. He is a multi-millionaire and has never played a red ball first class cricket game anywhere.
Wow.
And I think the fear for Australian cricket will be, if you look at someone like a Sam Constas, when Sam Constas gets to 26 years of age, 27 years of age, if he hasn't nailed down a spot in the Australian Test team and IPL owners come knocking, and the way we're looking at it now, that IPL owners are starting to own different teams in different franchise competitions. So you've got some IPL teams have now owning teams in the 100 in England. They are virtually owning the entire South African T20 competition. They have their fingers in the pie in the Caribbean, and they're also making overtures to Cricket Australia to buy large slices of BBL franchises. So if you're Sam Constas, just to use a name, and you're 26 years of age, and someone comes to you and says, we'll give you $2.5 million a year to play 6 weeks in the IPL, 4 weeks in the BBL, 4 weeks in South Africa, and then go and play the ITL T20 in the UAE. The rest of the time you can get on the golf course if you like, or if you got a girlfriend, stay at home with her. Yeah, I wonder, Dan, about the future of international cricket, given the fact that there is just going to be so much money around.
Do you think Sam Constas will make it? And do you think playing that innings, which was spoken about forever against Bumrah, who was in magnificent form in that series a couple of years ago, was the worst thing that could have happened to him?
I wouldn't say it's the worst thing. He's probably made a lot of money out of it. Endorsements and people recognise him and all that sort of thing, if that's what he wants. But I think for the development of his game, I don't think it did help, because we then started to see, even in the first or second overs of Sheffield Shield matches after he was dropped, he was, still trying to ramp fast bowlers over first slip and everything like that. Yeah, I think at times, in any sport, you can, believe your own publicity too much and, can overtake things, which is where I said, Harry Brook is a modern day cricketer, came into the system, when franchise cricket was very much up and running. He has been able to take T20 cricket into Test cricket and vice versa. But yeah, it's too early to say with Sam Constas as to whether he will make it or not. I'd be surprised if he doesn't get another opportunity. He's obviously a tremendous talent, but as I said, if there was a young Cameron Green coming through now, or a young Bo Webster, where they are going to be, especially Cameron Green is the highest paid player that's gone in the IPL option, the last IPL option, when I say highest paid non-Indian player. There'll be a lot of people that will have that money thrown at them around the world. And whilst Australia can perhaps proof itself a little bit, as England did with someone like Jofra Archer, they gave him a separate contract, the ECB, to make sure he didn't play franchise cricket. So they elevated his pay packet. But if you're looking at countries like South Africa, certainly Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, New Zealand, the West Indies, if you want to go as far as Ireland and Afghanistan, who are now full member nations of the ICC, how enticing is it to take the 7-figure sums when your board can provide nowhere near that amount of money to represent your country? And I think gone will be the days, Dan, unless you're someone like Cheteshwar or Pujara, where you are just a Test cricketer. I think maybe from 5 years down the track, if not even today, when people make their debuts, if they are potentially a multi-format player, I don't think we're going to see many players play 100 Test matches anymore.
Which is certainly sad because we've had a lot play them over the last 20 or 30 years.
Oh, yeah.
Glenn, can I change tack? I know your wife, the great Karen Ty, loved the Winter Olympics and would always promote it when she was the magnificent host of Summer Grandstand and would have some great interviews as well. How well did we go? It was a magnificent performance. We're fighting out of our weight division to produce our best ever performance medals-wise and gold medals-wise at the recent Winter Olympics.
Brilliantly. I mean, there's history there. Vancouver, well, back in 2010 was the previous benchmark, 3 gold, 2 silver, a bronze. Jakara Anthony becomes the first dual gold medalist for Australia. It is amazing. I mean, you look at that medal tally, 14th on the medal tally, a country that doesn't have any snow. I think we need to be realistic that, it is well funded in Australia, but pretty much everything they do is offshore.
Yes.
They're major training facilities and they are based in Europe. There are things, I think it's Threadbow that they've got, the AIS is sort of based here in Australia, but largely that's more of an identification place where they're getting young people with talent ID and giving them training. But once you get to that stage, you apply your trade overseas. It's a little bit like professional cycling, for example. I mean, if you're a professional road cyclist, you don't ride in Australia unless you come back for the Tour Down Under. The rest of the 11 months of the year, you're racing on roads in Europe. But it is remarkable to be 14th on the medal tally. You look at some of the teams either side of Australia that are true, alpine nations that have, snow for 5 months of the year. It is quite incredible. The diversity of sport in this country is something we should never underestimate. I mean, if you look at the Olympic Games, at handball, I don't know, a couple of other sports, volleyball, where we've never won a gold medal. But if you look across virtually everything else, whether it's, A to Z or A to Y, athletics to or aquatic to yachting, we've won gold or at least medals time after time. The population of 27 million, it is an incredible result.
Certainly is. And just before I let you go, Glenn, the West Coast Eagles, you worried about their medium to long-term future? There was a period there where they missed the finals twice in 2 years. They're the richest club, probably the most well-resourced club in the competition, but gee, their on-field performances just seem to be getting worse, don't they?
Yeah, it's going to be a big year for Andrew McWalton. There's no doubt about that. I mean, I think, even if they won 5 or 6 games, they are heading in the right direction. I think the main thing, Dan, for the West Coast Eagles is that they've got to not have massive blowouts. These 100-point losses, 12-goal losses, if they could win 5 games and have, a lot of other games where they lose by under 5 goals. Say they win 5 and they have 8 games where they lose by under 6 goals, 36 points. And they're in the game, when the final quarter starts. 5 games doesn't sound like a lot. But when you're coming from where they were last year, 5 games at least shows an upward trend. But the more worrying thing, I think, is if they win 5 games and they lose 5 by 100+ points, then you start to scratch your head and think, where are they going? Now, they've got a lot of high draft picks now. Harley Reid's going to be better for what he's so far experienced. Yeah, I think they'll improve, but whether it's an improvement enough that will keep the board and, the boards are kept happy primarily by how happy the fan base is. The fans will want to be able to see some improvement.
You still think Don Pike wants to coach again?
No.
No?
No, I don't think he has any aspirations for that now. And I can't see West Coast going down that path of pulling the CEO out and getting him out on the training track if they get rid of Andrew McWalton. No, I think they'd go elsewhere and they'd look for either a coach with experience and bring him across outside WA or, do what Collingwood has done a couple of times or with what they've done with McRae, go for an untried coach, what Brisbane did with Fagan. Once he was in the system, he was actually like more of a football manager at Hawthorn than a coach. But no, I don't think Don has any aspirations of putting the whistle in his mouth and controlling training on a Tuesday and Thursday.
And one last thing before I do let you go, and I appreciate your time on Dashing Gay and Sporting Adventures for Brenny Brothers Brewery. Have you got a favourite Dennis Comettiism?
Oh, I think probably just given the circumstance and the size of the crowd and the focus that was on it, the creeping up on him like a librarian, I just think was incredible. And I guess the other one too, which most people have to stop and think, hang on, I've got to get the wording right here.
Yeah.
Went into the pack optimistic and came out misty optically in regard to Tony Liberatore.
Yeah.
But, there was also, there was Gasper, the unfriendly post,
Yeah.
The collision of the Carr brothers, the same registration. But he was brilliant. He was absolutely brilliant. One thing I'll leave you with, Dan, that there was one that he had in his mind that he quite openly spoke about after it happened.
Yeah.
He had in his mind and he had written it down and taken it to memory that one day, he wanted to say with Anthony Rock, a rock between, now what's the actual thing? Between I've forgotten it.
A rock and a hard place.
And a hard place.
Yeah. Yeah.
A rock and a hard
place. No, caught between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah, and that was one of the bits he wanted to use with Anthony Rock, and he eventually got to use it in a piece of commentary. And he stored those things away for 3, 4, 5 years. Yeah. Now, I don't know, for example, whether he would have ever sat down and thought, if Gasper hitched the post one night, I'm going to say Gasper the unfriendly post. But yeah, he was, and the library, I don't know whether he thought about that. I think the cork in the ocean with Peter Wilson was probably just something that came to him bang, snap of the fingers, and he just came out with that. And that was until the librarian and the optimistically, and that was probably his most famous, aside from, of course, Centimetre Perfect. And if you had spoken to Dan, he would say, I don't know why people got so excited. All I did was take Inch Perfect and convert it from imperial to metric. So he was a great broadcaster, Dan, a great bloke, and we all miss him. There's no doubt about that.
We certainly do. Now, Glenn, I know you've had your fitness or health issues in recent times. I wish you all the best. I wish Karen and James all the best, and I really appreciate you joining us to have a chat about Dennis Cometti and many other things in sport, of which you are still the oracle, a great mentor of mine. And Glenn Mitchell's been my guest for Dashing Down Sporting Adventures for Brenny Brothers Brewery. Their website, www.brennybros.com. They're pioneers of the Australian beer brewing industry, having first started brewing in Williamstown in 1864. They're available in cans at many independent liquor stores and on tap at some great pubs and clubs. As I mentioned earlier, James and also Justin, Australian-owned family business profits, stay in Australia as opposed to many top-selling beer brands that are foreign-owned. Great to catch up, and we'll speak again soon. Thanks, Glenn.
Hang on, Daniel. You don't get away that easy. When I used to work with you, and even after working with you, I'd always ask you early in the season, how will the Western Bulldogs go? Now, I know you're 1-0. You had plenty of the sponsors product last week, and you're pumping your chest out.
Yep.
Okay. Come September, are they going to be playing in September or not, Dashing?
I think they can play in September. I still worry about the back line, but I think they've got most other areas under control. They still conceded 100 points, and that remains a concern for me, but I like the way they fall back on the weekend. But it is one game. They've got their bunnies this week in GWS, but a pretty tough draw early days. And I think they're good enough to make the 8 this year and even go better than maybe the wild card, finish top 6. But we'll just wait and see. It's always fraught with danger, the Western Bulldogs, Glenn, when you get too over involved as I do, but I think top 6. How's that sound?
That's very good, Dan. I never really ever listen to back to stuff that I do, but I'm going to listen back to the last minute of our discussion and chop it out.
Yes.
And I will keep that until the last week of August.
Because I used to always say to you, bottom 4, Glenn, didn't I, when we worked together?
Bottom 4, often midway through the season, Dan, when they were about 9-3, you'd say bottom 4.
Yes, exactly right.
Yep.
Great to chat, and we'll speak soon. All the best.
Good on you. Thanks, Dashing.